Greetings and welcome to the Chamber of Medford and Jackson County's virtual forum. Today's program is sponsored by Travel Medford and brought to you by our season sponsor, the Cow Creek Tribe. I'm Eli Matthews, Senior Vice President for Travel Medford, and I'll be your MC for today's program. We have an exciting program set out for you today, featuring our keynote speaker, Dr. Chris Thornburg, PhD, founding partner at Beacon Economics, who will guide us through today's program on the national and local economic trends. Also with us today, we have Jason Foster, Air Services and Economic Development Manager for the Rogue Valley International Medford Airport and our Vice Chair for our Travel Medford Tourism Council, who will be doing the closing remarks today. Thank you both for being here today. To begin, I want to thank all the forum sponsors who have helped us put on these programs this year. We're truly looking forward to the days when we can meet in person at Forum again. And it may finally appear that those days are on the horizon. So thank you for your continued support in helping us bring these important topics front and center for the business community. Now, what we do for every forum is to remind everybody how it works. Some of you already know this, but for those of you that are new, you have noticed that you are not on the screen and you do not have video or microphone capabilities. You are simply an attendee. However, there is a Q&A feature on the presentation. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see a Q&A. Go ahead and feel free during Dr. Thornburg's presentation to input any questions that you might have. And at the end, I'll go through those and moderate for Dr. Thornburg. So before I introduce the speaker, I just want to share a few exciting highlights about Travel Medford and our local travel and tourism momentum that we currently have. Every year, Travel Medford sponsors this May Forum in recognition of National Travel and Tourism Week. The pandemic, as you know, has been extremely challenging for our industry. In fact, in Oregon in 2020, our visitor spending was down over 58%. However, thankfully, our community locally has weathered the storm a lot better than most of the state, and most of our metrics are trending in the right direction as it relates to the recovery. Year to date, our hotel occupancy is actually up 52%. Before the pandemic, travel in America was a $2.6 trillion industry supporting over 17 million American jobs. Here locally, the industry supports over 5,700 jobs and produces over 1.1 billion in economic impact for Southern Oregon. National Travel and Tourism Week is an opportunity for us to remind our visitors and community really of what travel is all about. And it's not just about our local economy and our workforce, but also our community's identity and the cultures it brings. So since our last May Forum, despite the challenges this past year, our community has really made some outstanding strides forward. And we have some excellent momentum. And I want to take some time and just touch base on a few of these highlights with you today. First off, currently, Medford is building 2 brand new hotels. We're going to be adding 177 rooms into our inventory. We have My Place Hotel by the airport and the Fairfield Inn and Suites on the south end, both being constructed right now, going to be done within the next month. It's going to be great for our overall inventory. We have PRS in the Rogue Valley Manor with their development around the Centennial Golf Course, adding over 1,400 residential units, and really is a robust master plan that they're unfolding and really spending over $500 million development ventures. We're looking forward to that to start as well. Medford, if you haven't heard, is getting the first Margaritaville in the state. So for you Tiki Lounge fans, it's going to be slated to be open this next year. It's going to be a great asset for our community. Asante is going to be opening up the $64 million cancer center. It's planned to be done this coming winter. This past month, we heard the great news about Avelo Airlines coming to Medford. They just had their first flight here recently. It opened up to MFR, another destination direct to Hollywood and Burbank. This is great for Medford. This is going to be our 12th direct destination and is a huge win for Medford. Also, the city of Medford, I wanted to highlight, is leading a 2040 Vision Task Force. It's currently underway and will be wrapping up by the end of the year. And it really has the end result and goal of having some large, impactful goals to achieve for our community and to bring more measurable success and victories for our community. And I just encourage you to get engaged and to learn more, visit Medford medford2040.org. Again, medford2040.org. Perhaps the most thrilling news that we have here at Travel Medford and the Chamber is the passing of last May's bond to build the Rogue Credit Union Community Complex, which is another massive win for our community. This 160,000 square foot, $60 million mixed use facility that's been in the works for a lot of years is going to be a huge attraction and a huge driver for our local economy. And it's going to be constructed here shortly and be done probably towards the end of 2023. So as you can see, despite all the hardships this last year, our community has many successes to talk and brag about, and Travel Medford is ready and eager to welcome back visitors and help drive our Rogue Valley's recovery efforts. And now to get to hear from our keynote speaker about the trajectory of tourism in Southern Oregon and why the region is poised for even more growth, we have Dr. Chris Thornburg, a great friend to chambers across the West. I've heard him speak I think over probably five times now, and each time is better than the last. Dr. Thornburg is founded the Beacon Economics in 2006. Under his leadership, the firm has become one of the most respected research organizations in California, serving public and private sector clients across the United States. In 2015, Dr. Thornburg also became director of the UC Riverside School of Business for Economic Forecasting and Development, and he's an adjunct professor at the school. He's an expert in economic revenue forecasting, regional economics, economic policy, and labor and real estate markets. Dr. Thornburg has consulted a lot privately, cities, counties, as well as public agencies. And he became nationally known for his forecasting the subprime mortgage market crash that started in 2007, and was truly one of the few economists on record that predicted the global economic recession that followed. Dr. Thornburg has a PhD in business economics from UCLA. And with that, welcome you, Dr. Thornburg. Thanks for speaking, and the virtual floor is yours.
Oh, thank you very much, Eli. I appreciate that. And good morning, good afternoon, everybody. I am super pleased to kind of be here with you. As you know, of course, we are having to run this thing virtually. But you know, what's interesting is I'm still local. I'm actually out here on the Rogue River doing my talk from here. So I'm getting to enjoy the wonderful, wonderful hospitality that Medford has to offer. Even though I'm giving you a little bit of update on where the economy and where things are heading. So with that in mind, I'm going to go ahead and actually turn off my camera as well. And let's go ahead and get right into it, so to speak. My talk today is really going to be based on four big themes. And there's a lot of things to talk about. We have a limited amount of time, but let's just kind of get it summed up in this particular way. Yes, the last year has been truly unprecedented. I'm sure you've heard that more times than you really wanted to. And it was a truly tragic period, in as much as millions of people across the globe have lost loved ones. And of course, we have to think about those families and what they're going through right now. But at the same time, the conversations about the economy have been, at best, hyperbolic. Natural disasters do not have long-run economic consequences. And as tragic as the last year has been, a quicker than normal recovery, that is to say from a typical business cycle, was almost certain. And a lot of people don't appreciate that. Indeed, the conversation at the beginning of this thing kept talking about things like Great Depressions, which were never in the cards. Now, with that in mind, because of that conversation, which really stems from what I would call the miserabilism that has so badly inflicted our nation over the past couple of years, we had a really interesting sort of confluence of events that led to what I would call, again, charitably, an incredible overreaction on the part of fiscal and monetary authorities. For example, the degree of fiscal policy, the $5 trillion plus in stimulus lobbed at the economy, we've never seen anything like this before. It is so over the top. It was such an excessive overreaction. Now, there's some good things to this. Obviously, a quick recovery is now going to be even quicker. Indeed, I will say it right now that you're going to see an economy that is going to be absolutely roaring over the next couple of years. We are truly entering into the new roaring 20s, if you will. However, the thing about policy, fiscal and monetary policy, is there are costs. And people aren't really appreciating the costs involved here. And those costs are both short run, that is to say, massive amount of stimulus put into the economy is creating dangerous instabilities in the financial markets, the potential for inflation and higher interest rates. And from a long run perspective, let's remember that we're going to be, over just these 2 years, borrowing $7 trillion. We're adding 33% of annual output to our federal debt base when we're already in the midst, of course, of a dangerous path of federal debt driven by retiring boomers and the entitlement programs. This is not a good thing. There are problems here that we're generating by not thinking about the long run. Now, also thinking about the long run, of course, the other thing besides unprecedented that you've heard over and over is the new normal. And I got to tell you, anytime somebody anywhere said new normal as a result of the pandemic, I immediately closed the paper, turned off the TV, or switched off the radio. Because to be clear, there's no such thing as new normals when it comes to epidemics. They've been with humanity since the dawn of civilization. But with that in mind, it is absolutely the case that this pandemic is accelerating trends that were already in place. And those are trends you need to think about from a land use perspective, from an economic development perspective. And we'll come back to those thoughts at the end of this thing. And then, of course, housing. As you know, housing is on fire. Wood prices are going up. And a lot of folks are thinking, well, what's going on here? Is this sustainable? The good news is it absolutely is sustainable. And indeed, you're really seeing more of a switch driven by what I would call different attitudes about housing, rather than anything that would look like another bubble like we saw a little over a decade ago. So I'm okay with where housing is going right now. And I think from a Medford conversation, it's important to consider these trends and some of the longer run problems we're seeing in the US economy. So that's the big picture. Now what I want to do is, again, go through a lot of data. If you've seen my presentations before, when I've had an opportunity to be here and talk in person, you know I'm pretty data intensive. So let's dive right in. And as noted, I'm hoping to have a little bit of time at the end for some Q&A. Again, throw it in that Q&A box if it's something that interests you. So we get into the beginning of this thing, and for those of you who've seen my talks in the past, I've discussed the idea of miserabilism and this kind of place the U.S. finds itself in from a psychological perspective. In our world, whether you're a journalist or you're a politician, you feel compelled by the temper of the time, if you will, to constantly tell everybody that not only is the glass half full, and it's emptying rapidly. And that was a feature of really the last expansion, and it became incredibly acute in the midst of this downturn. You heard you can see all the right-hand side, all these crazy headlines, recession, depression-like crisis, 30% American home loans are going to stop paying, home prices are going to fall, the labor market is going to be scarred for a decade. The preposterous predictions at the beginning of this thing were out of control. Now, most of the folks, of course, were talking about a U-shaped recovery, a long, painful, slow recovery that was going to take years and years, very much like what we saw at the back end of the Great Recession, which, of course, was the last big business cycle in the U.S. Now, right from the get-go, we said, look, this is not that kind of business cycle. Yes, it's tragic, but natural disasters have short-term economic consequences. And so right from the get-go, we said, look, as tough as this is, as eye-popping as the numbers are, realistically, V is the only logical outcome. That is to say, we anticipate a quick recovery. And I'll tell you, that actually happened last year. You know, people are fond of pointing out that this was the deepest recession in economic history. Completely true. It was also the shortest. Recessions are measured peak to trough. The peak of this recession the last expansion occurred in February. The trough of the recession happened in May. So yes, a record downturn that ended in 2 months. And by the end of last year, even in the face of by far and away the worst surge in number of new cases in the US to date, the only thing you can say is that recovery only slowed down a bit. And the fact that more and more economists are now coming around and understanding that the economy will recover quickly can be best sort of summarized in this graph, which is the Wall Street Journal prediction for overall growth in 2021. And you could see how grim it was at the beginning of this thing versus how good it is right now. Everybody's already predicting a 6% plus growth year. By the way, a 6% plus growth year puts us basically back on trend by the end of this thing. Overall, from beginning to the full recovery, this is going to be less than 2 years. Contrast at the Great Recession, which was 9 years. Now, why was it so different? Why a different kind of situation? Well, let's think about what happened last time versus this time. For example, last time, the subprime bubble collapsed and then drove us into a recession. But remember, the subprime bubble also vastly overheated the economy, particularly housing and consumer borrowing, in ways we had never seen before in the US. In other words, as good as growth felt in 2006, that growth was rotten to the core because of fundamentals. This time around, actually, yes, this economy had slowed a bit at the end of 2019, but actually the fundamentals were very good. There was none of this excessive degree of debt, excessive degree of housing construction, so on and so forth. For example, when we entered the Great Recession, we had a record high level of debt to income and a record low savings rate. Entering into the pandemic, we actually had a record low financial obligations ratio, which is the cost of debt relative to incomes, and savings rates were at a 30-year high. American households were better able to handle a short-run disruption this time around than they were last time around. Housing, last time, again, housing was completely on fire through that last expansion before it collapsed after, a record share of housing for sale for rent, massive amount of price growth, a massive number of new units. This time around, we entered the pandemic with a housing market that was actually relatively cool, but again, had very, very good fundamentals. The recession driver, this is also very important. Back then, it was a demand shock. What that means is when all that wealth sort of disappeared because the bubble collapsed, people suddenly realized they had to rebuild their household balance sheet. And that caused the entire economy to be weak. Yes, certain sectors were particularly hard hit, but there was a general malaise across the entire economy as people worked to rebuild their household balance sheet. This time around, it wasn't a demand shock, it was a supply shock. People didn't stop going to restaurants last year because they didn't have any money the way they did, say, in 2010. They stopped going to restaurants last year because they couldn't go to restaurants last year. A health official said they couldn't, or they were worried about going and maybe getting sick and getting grandma sick and so on and so forth. The reason that's important is when people are denied the ability to spend money where they want, they will make up for part of it by spending it somewhere else. Last time around, there was a general malaise across the entire economy. This time, weakness in certain parts of the economy actually created excessive degree of growth in other parts of the economy, a winner-loser type recession, which was completely different and almost untalked about. And of course, government stimulus, last time too little too late, this time too much too soon. So again, a completely different kind of business cycle. Now, there's no doubt that last year was rough, but not as rough as people have been predicting. Overall, we only saw about a 3.5% decline in GDP in overall 2020 relative to 2019. Remember, this year they're talking about a 6% growth rate. In other words, completely making up for what happened last year and getting us back on trend. And you already see that happening. In the first quarter of the year, we had a 6.4% growth rate, and it's worth pointing out that they're already predicting an 11% growth rate for the second quarter. So you see the economy absolutely surging right now. A lot of things are happening. And as already noted, it's a different kind of business cycle. It's a winner-loser type recovery. Look on the left-hand side. This is real consumer spending by type of product, durables, non-durables, and services. And I've indexed them so you can see the broad trends. Everybody got hit at the beginning of this thing. Everybody was kind of fearful, had no idea where it was going. But again, as we got through the year, people understood the risks, and they started to spend money, not where they couldn't. I mean, you think about consumer services, which is hotels and Disneyland and restaurants. Those places didn't come back. Indeed, even coming into March of this year, it's still below pre-pandemic levels. But spending on non-durables and durables, goods, stuff, well, that's through the roof. Indeed, the idea is, hey, I can't take the family to Disneyland, so let's go buy a camper, which, by the way, costs about the same amount. So you can see how that happens. And you can see that winner-loser structure on the right-hand side. This is retail sales February to February, because that's the peak of the pre-pandemic peak. Online sales at 27%, sporting goods 15%, hardware 15%, food and beverage stores 11%, auto dealers 10%. A lot of companies did very well. A lot of companies didn't. Restaurant, bars down 16%, clothing, which is a proxy for, of course, malls, down 12%, so on and so forth. And with the goods economy coming back, so did industrial production. Industrial production got back to trend within less than a year before, of course, we ran across a different kind of problem. You can see the big wobbles over the last couple of months in that industrial production index. It's no longer a recession conversation. It's really a conversation about the problems that the supply chains are having because they were not prepared for the chaos going on right now. And indeed, they're still trying to catch up. The Institute for Supply Management came out for last month, and it was the highest it has been since 1984. So the goods part of the US economy is on fire. The big issue, of course, is that our supply chains are all screwed up because supply chains were not prepared. Everybody said they bought into the miserables. This is going to be a 10-year business cycle. Hey, man, close down that extra line, lay off the new employees. Things came roaring back. That hit the global logistics chain as well. Goods trade is back. Service trade's still way down, not a surprise. That's global tourism. But goods trade is back to where it was pre-pandemic. And as a result of that, because shippers and the ports weren't ready for it, it's been complete chaos out there. There are the backlogs at all the ports, and with the backlog at the ports, again, you're starting to have issues with, of course, supply of for example, the auto sector can't get enough microchips, and therefore used cars are incredibly hot demand right now. And you can see that here. Take a look at the airport, the freight versus airline passengers. 2020 was obviously a horrible year for airline passenger traffics, and 2021 isn't starting off much better, although we have better numbers on that I'll come back to. On the other hand, take a look at the right-hand side of freight. 2020 was a record year for freight going in and out of that airport. Goes back to the idea that some parts of the economy were doing great. And of course, with all those problems in the supply chain, lo and behold, input prices are going up, 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 not the least of which, of course, is lumber, which is up 65% year over year. The cost of lumber right now is off the charts, as everybody who's in that business knows. And again, it's because nobody was really prepared for the big bounce in economic activity that actually, again, as already noted, was in the cards right from the get-go. Now, some parts of the economy were going to lag. For example, this is data from Opportunity Insights, which is a wonderful think tank out of Harvard. It does high-frequency data. They've made a lot of that data freely available on their website. You should go check it out. It's kind of fun. But this is data on spending, particularly in those hard-hit services sectors, transportation, that's airplanes, entertainment and recreation, that's Disneyland, restaurants and hotels. And you can see that as much recovery as we saw at the end of last year, they had stalled out. But now, of course, over the last couple of months, they're starting to grow again. And this all has to do, of course, with the rollout of these vaccines. The United States is far ahead of the rest of the world. We all have heard about the problem that India is having, that Japan is starting to have again. But here in the United States, we're ahead of the pack. We were hitting 4 million doses a day. And you can see on the right-hand side, like, for example, in much of the nation, well over 45%, and that includes Oregon, 45% of the population has had at least one dose of the vaccine. So we really are getting there. Yeah, it was a bit more slow of a rollout than we'd hoped for, but we're getting there. And you can see it in the number of new cases, which is not right now running basically the same as it was at the end of last summer, and almost assuredly will continue to drop. Yes, here and there are some places that are heating up. Michigan's still having some issues. Of course, in parts of Oregon, a little bit of a flare-up at this particular point in time. But again, things are much, much better than they were, and people are starting to go out again. If you haven't seen it in the traffic, you'll see it in the bars. Things are starting to happen. And as already noted, TSA numbers are absolutely on the way up. You can see, for example, on the left-hand side, TSA pass-throughs from the start of the year for the last 3 years. We're doing a heck of a lot better than we were a year ago, but not quite as good as 2 years ago, but things are starting to heat up. And going back to that winner-loser kind of conversation, on the right-hand side, I have a bunch of different regions. This is California data. I apologize for that. I couldn't find equivalent data for Oregon. But it's interesting because what you see, if you look at hotel data, the hotels that are doing terrible in California are Orange County, San Diego, San Francisco, whereas, of course, up in the High Sierra, the Inland Empire, North Coast, Shasta, Cascade, actually doing pretty well. Well, the issue here, of course, yet again, goes back to the win-or-loser nature of things. Look, fly-in tourism has been dead and continues to be dead. It's just starting to come back now. But drive-in tourism has been great because people are so sick to death of being cooped up in their home. And yes, you saw that in Medford. There's no doubt about it. During the last part of the year, you saw actually 2020 occupancies were 9% over the previous year, 15% by the end of the year, even in the face of that worst surge in cases to date. People were eager to get out, and you can see that in the local data, how good the local economy has been doing here. And that isn't going to stop. This was a survey that was done near the last year. The ASTA did a wonderful survey. They said, hey, what are you going to do when the pandemic goes away? And not surprisingly, the vast majority of people said, I'm going traveling. So it's going to keep going. You're going to have a couple great years ahead of you, no doubt about it. Now, that's been a lot of good news I just gave you. You know, Profits have bounced back. The goods part of the economy is on fire. Yet the one part, of course, you don't see it is in those labor market numbers. We just had a very bad month, 200,000 jobs after the previous month of 100 million jobs. And we're still well below where we were pre-pandemic, 7.5 million jobs down. And you look at that and you go, wow, this is horrible. But again, it's not quite what you think it is. It's an interesting situation because parts of the labor market are clearly suffering, but other parts of the market are actually very, very tight. And it's a very confluence of a situation where we have bizarrely a situation by which we have high unemployment and an incredibly tight labor market happening at the same time. And a lot of people are scratching their heads about it. What's going on? Well, take a look on the right-hand side. You can see this firsthand. The unemployment rate in the U.S. is still about 6%, which is 2 percentage points higher than it was pre-pandemic. So elevated, not high for the long run standpoint. Obviously, it was significantly higher than this for almost 8 years post-Great, 6 great years post-Great Recession. But look at the job openings rate. The job openings rate was depressed for years post-Great Recession. This time around, this is February day, by the way, the job openings rate was already at an all-time high level. Very interesting circumstance. And remember, that's in part because of some parts of the economy doing. Manufacturing can't hire people. They can't find anybody. Well, why aren't they hiring these unemployed people? Well, the people unemployed came out of restaurants. They came out of hotels. These are not the kind of people who have the skills or, candidly, the interest of working in manufacturing. So it's a very interesting standpoint. Another issue going on the left-hand side, this is the share of unemployed workers on temporary layoff. And by the way, this is one of the reasons why so many economists got their predictions so dead wrong at the beginning of this thing. Everybody said, hey, when unemployment rate goes up, it takes a long time to come down. When it was 14%, everybody was having a meltdown. But yeah, as high as that 14% was, 80% of those people didn't lose their jobs. They were on temporary layoff. No one lost their job. They said, hey, my job's right over there. I just can't go to it because the public health official telling me I'm not allowed to. It's a different kind of conversation. And by the way, that's still elevated. Even last month, it was above 20%. So of that 6% of people who are unemployed, about 1.2 percentage points of them are actually people who aren't looking for a job in a traditional sense. I'm on temporary layoff. I'm just waiting back to go to my old job. And of course, the other thing that's certainly keeping the situation from clearing up is we still have almost at least for the last 20 years, a record high number of people who are getting unemployment insurance. And they're getting very good unemployment insurance, greater than normal because of all the federal add-ons, 40%. So 20% just waiting for the job to come back, 40% getting really nice payments. And as a result of that, we have this weird situation of elevated unemployment, even as we have these incredibly tight labor markets. You can see it. Again, I get so frustrated with folks who just want to go out of the way to talk about how terrible everything is when it's not. And here's another place you could see it. The cute term that the press has lobbed onto, it's a K-shaped recovery. It's great for skilled people, but terrible for unskilled. Well, first of all, every recovery is a K-shaped recovery. There's nothing particularly new about that. And also, by the way, this is probably the least K-shaped recovery we've ever seen. Take a look on the left-hand side. This is earnings growth by level of education. Again, go back to the Great Recession. Look at the collapse in earnings growth for everybody, but particularly worse for those who have a high school degree or less. And this time around, there was no slowdown in earnings growth for anybody. And that's because, yes, for somebody who lost some hours or lost their job, there was somebody else who was getting more hours. Yes, if you're a line chef, you probably didn't work a lot last year. If you're a mid-level manager at the local Home Depot, you had more hours than you've ever had before. It wasn't quite that clear. And indeed, for all the conversation about how rough it is out there and how many people are suffering, take a look at this. This is more Opportunity Insights data. They are breaking down consumer spending by level of income. Low-income families, in aggregate, they're spending 22% more now than they were pre-pandemic. Whereas for high-income people, only 3.9% up. The spending gap in the U.S. is not being driven by low-income households, by high-income households. Now, I'm not saying we should feel bad for high-income households. They're still earning lots of money. They're just not waiting to spend it. So this goes back to the idea that much of the missing consumption is really pent-up demand that will come out over the course of the next couple of years. And of course, the other issue is this. And this is something I've talked about when I've come up here the last couple of times. The big issue in the country right now is a labor shortage problem. And you've heard about that. The population growth over the course of the last year, record low in the United States. Birth rates, the only time birth rates were lower in the United States was in the mid 1970s, which is an entirely different conversation. Otherwise, the lowest birth rate ever seen. And of course, as a result of that, boomers retiring, growth in working age population has actually been dipping in the negative territory. We have labor shortage issues in the United States, which means these temporary issues in the market, in the labor markets, are going to go away very, very quickly. And it's amazing how different that is from the conversation that you hear at the federal level, at the state level, where everybody's wringing their hands, talking about how this is an end of days type situation. It's not. Indeed, you hear a lot, of course, about the decline in participation rates. People call it the she-cession because all these women with kids can't work and it's terrible. Look, there is a little bit of that. There's no doubt about it. Take a look at women. Yes, for women who are in those years where they have particularly school-age kids, big drop in participation, almost assuredly. The burden of having those kids is tough. But for me, I'm not as worried about that. I know when schools reopen, those women will go back into the workforce for the most part. I'm worried about the 55 and up male and female because these folks may have decided to retire permanently in the midst of this mess. And that's going to make those labor shortage problems vastly more acute post-pandemic than it was pre-pandemic. So we do have issues in the labor market, but it's a shortage problem, not an excess supply problem. As for Medford itself, well, up to the pandemic, Medford had hit a record level of employment. Payroll jobs had, for the first time over that 2019 period, gotten above 90,000. The previous peak was a little less than 85,000 back pre-Great Recession. So the region really had started to bounce back. Yes, a big hit, but believe it or not, overall, jobs are starting to mount back. You can see the really good numbers for the last couple months of data coming right into this last month. Still down about 6.7%. I'm sorry, it's about 3.8% overall in the area. Of course, contrast that to Oregon overall, which is 6.7%. In other words, Medford is actually one of the strongest economies in the state right now. And going back to that odd nature of this bifurcated recovery, take a look at the left-hand side. This is average weekly earnings for people in Medford. And look what's happened over the last year to average weekly earnings. Now, again, this is a little bit of a mixed bag. What it is in part, the people who dropped out of the labor force, who are not working right now, tend to be lower paid, low weekly hour type of jobs. That biases who's left upwards. But then for those who remained in the labor market, they had a great year for earnings growth last year. And the net result of that was an enormous surge in these average weekly earnings in the local area. And you took on the right-hand side, again, as much as those employment numbers still look a little weak, unemployment rates right here in Medford and actually in the overall state are below 6%. Again, a much quicker recovery. The economy is much stronger than it was post-Great Recession. And more good news here on the left-hand side, where most of the nation is struggling with labor force, there's actually been a bounce in labor force availability over the course of the last couple of years here in Medford. Now, for me, this is a little bit temporary. On the right-hand side, you can see the population of Medford. You had a good surge in the middle of last decade. It has slowed down recently. And again, you've got to pay attention to your population base, the population growth, because ultimately population is how you're going to create the workers that are going to fill those jobs, which is going to allow the region to continue to grow. Now, what about small business? Again, you've heard a lot of things about this, about how terrible things are. And this is interesting. This is data, again, from Opportunity Insights on small business closures. According to the data, even as of April 21st, 27%, 1 out of 4 small businesses in Oregon remains closed. You look at that and you go, wow, how can all the rest of this data be good? Well, here's the other side of it. This is Oregon business applications, a 12-month average. And yes, your eyes are not deceiving you. This is the highest rate of business applications ever seen in the state since they started collecting this data. What's going on? Well, again, yes, all those entrepreneurs close the doors. You're not going to reopen your restaurant if it's been closed for 14 months and you have to pay back 13, 14 months of back rent. What are you going to do? You're going to go open a new restaurant. And that's what these entrepreneurs are getting ready to do. Now, when they do open it, what's the economy going to look like? And this, of course, comes back to the conversation about federal policy overreactions. And they have been, again, almost preposterous how much as we've kind of gone overboard. $5 trillion 5 trillion, almost 25% of GDP of stimulus lobbed at the US economy. We've never seen anything like it. And remember, as already noted, as bad as those labor numbers look, they aren't as bad when you scratch away. For example, earnings for people who kept their jobs were really good last year. So overall, even as we got into the beginning of 2021, compensation for employees in the United States had already gotten back to their pre-pandemic level overall. But the government didn't act like this, and yet they couldn't stop giving people money fast enough. For every dollar of lost income over the last year, the federal government has put back $3.50, 3.5 to 1 replacement on earnings. It's crazy. And you know, when you think about how they did it, it even gets weirder. Take, for example, the most popular program involved for these last three things, direct transfers of people, just giving people a check, mailing it out. Incredibly popular. As divided as our nation is, Trump supporters and Biden supporters can't talk to each other for 5 minutes without the insults flying. Yet, somehow or other, these two groups of people can agree on one thing. We all love free money. Give us another check. What? And you say, well, what's wrong with that, Chris? Well, listen, the people who lost their jobs needed money, and they got it through unemployment. But for those people who didn't lose their jobs, they had a good year last year. They made money. Their problem wasn't the ability to spend money in as much as they didn't have money to spend. It was the ability to spend money because the things they wanted to spend it on weren't available to them. It was a supply shock. Giving people money when their problem is they can't spend money is not stimulus. That's just basic financial enrichment on the basis of our children. And that's the same thing for the PPP loans, which seems so good on the surface until you realize that there was no effort to direct PPP loans to businesses that need it. It was whoever had their CPA and their banker on speed dial. Those are the companies that got it. That's not how you're supposed to do it. Here's a way of looking at it. This was a survey that was done post first stimulus check. And of that post first stimulus check, 80% of the money, 80% for the first stimulus, 80% was saved, used to pay down debt, or was donated. 80%. Now again, that's not stimulus. That is people just getting richer. Stimulus is when you take this money and spend it, not save it. And you can see, by the way, how much dry powder it's created in our economy. The vast majority of stimulus did very little in the economy in the short run. This economic bounce back we've seen would have happened mostly without all this money. But this money is sitting in the financial system. It basically passed through people into the financial system. Cumulative household savings over the past year and a quarter, up 2.2 trillion. $2.2 trillion in excess savings. On the right-hand side, excess bank deposits, $3 trillion above trend. $3 trillion above trend. There is so much money floating around this economy right now waiting to be spent. And you ask yourself, gee, Chris, why is the PE ratio in the stock market at a second highest level? Well, now we know. Why is it a Bitcoin worth $55,000 or $60,000? And to be clear, as an economist, let me explain to you, the fundamental value of Bitcoin is zero. It's not worth a damn thing. But of course, these markets are batty. $60,000 these things are charging for right now. And of course, look what's happening with people using this money. This is a survey. What percent of respondents invested stock market using government stimulus checks? Again, not what it's for. For the younger set, in particular, 2/3 of the stimulus money they threw into the stock market. What is going on? Now, again, this is not free money. $7 trillion. $7 trillion in new government debt. $7 trillion. And we are using it to enrich ourselves. The financial obligations ratio, that is to say the debt burden for our generation, was already the lowest it's ever been prior to the pandemic. And because of our wonderful low interest rates that allow us to refi, because of all this wonderful money the government's lobbing at us, is now even significantly lower than that. We are enriching ourselves on the back of our children. It's like walking into your baby's room, who's, you know, a cute kid, he's 8 months old, and you walk up to the crib and you drop in a $20,000 IOU. Here you go, kid. Happy birthday. What are we doing? History will not look kindly at us. It won't, because this is the point in time where we need to be dealing with the future federal debt crisis driven by Medicare and Social Security. Yet as opposed to even talking about it, we can't borrow money fast enough. Bizarre. And of course, while we're talking about government and government debt, it's interesting to take a look at where local governments are. Some economies, Nevada got hit hard, Oregon got hit hard, Texas got hit hard, Washington, California didn't. Again, it has a lot to do with the structure of your revenue system. And these states that saw a big hit, looking at states that didn't see a big hit, you may need to think about how do we better, shall we say, build our local revenue system to be a little bit more, shall we say, solid in the face of these kind of issues. Every state needs to take a look at what's going on and think about how do we do better next time around? How do we become a little bit, shall we say, less prone to these situations? Well, that's a big question. By the way, it isn't just the federal government, it's also the Federal Reserve that's been going a little bit crazy. They have quantitative ease like we've never seen before, $3 trillion in quantitative easing. European central banks doing it, the Federal Reserve is doing it as well. And again, what battle are they fighting? They did as much quantitative easing in the first few weeks of this as they did through the first 5 years of the Great Recession. Why? What are they fighting? Back then, there was a collapse in household wealth. There was massive problems in the US financial system. None of those problems exist right now. They're fighting a war that isn't actually happening. That's a little crazy. And then you have to ask yourself, well, if we don't see a collapse in wealth, where's all this money going? And the answer is it's going into the money supply. Now, if you've been paying attention, there are a lot of folks worried about inflation, and everybody in the Federal Reserve is telling you inflation's not an issue, stop worrying about it. Well, first of all, don't worry about inflation right now, but the idea that inflation is not a worry is completely wrong. On the left-hand side, that blue line on top is what's called unit money supply. It's the amount of money divided by overall number of transactions. And the higher that is, the more inflationary we tend to be. And you could see, for example, how when it was relatively high in the 70s, it eventually led to various sorts of inflation issues. But then, we started seeing it growing from 1996 all the way to 2019 with no inflation. And that is why a lot of economists said, in this kind of economy, in this place, in this time, inflation isn't as big of a worry. But we are way outside the boundaries of a normal trend in money supply. You cannot look at this unit money supply being the highest it ever has been and say it's not potentially inflationary. Now, not in the short run. It takes a little more for inflation to kick in than just more money. You also have to have a full capacity economy, and we're getting close to that, but we're not quite there. And yes, while we're seeing some increases in inflation, some increases in interest rates, this is not a function yet, like I said, of that money supply. This is just financial markets going, oh, wait a minute, this recession isn't that bad. Okay, then we don't need to be pricing as if it's that bad. Business is saying, hey, actually, demand's pretty good. I'm going to go ahead and raise my prices. This is just a recovery role. The third key, of course, to having a lot of inflation is to have some sort of external demand shock while you have a full capacity economy and a lot of money. And that, of course, would be the $2 or $3 trillion infrastructure package you're doing right now. So yes, I'm really worried about inflation, but not now. I agree with everybody that what you're seeing today is not sustained inflation. But in 2023, if they don't back off and absorb some of that cash, we're going to have inflation. Now, another place, of course, you see all this money floating around. Another asset market is housing, which is absolutely on fire. Overall, take a look on the right-hand side. For example, if you look at Portland, 3.7% growth rate. This is annualized in 19. Heated up a little bit to 6%. And in the last 6 months, prices in Portland are growing at a 17% basis, same as the nation, 17% basis. Unbelievable increase. Now, why? What's going on out there? Is it a bubble? Is this sustainable? Well, we came into this pandemic with a housing market that was relatively cool. And the thing about housing markets is they have a feedback effect. If nobody's buying a home or very few people buying a home, you don't feel rushed. When everybody's buying a home, you feel rushed and you run around trying to buy a home. And that's exactly what happened. We went from a market that was fine fundamentally, but didn't have a lot of demand. And as a result of that, there was not a lot of demand forming. But then in the middle of this chaos, interest rates dropped. We already had a tight inventory. People started buying homes because they realized how small their house was. They had a lot of money saved up. They wanted to take advantage of slow interest rates, whatever it was. And because there was no inventory, We flipped from one extreme to the, we can take our time, to the, oh my God, I need a house now phenomenon. And it turned the market from being cool to being hot, incredibly hot. And yes, you're seeing it here. 2020 was a great year for homes sold, despite a weak summer. Prices are continuing to rise, getting close to 350,000 right now. You can see on the right-hand side how much the numbers are up. Big increases in prices, with, of course, the big increase in demand. Building is increasing. This is one of the hot spots of the U.S. economy. And even here in Medford itself, 2020 wasn't a bad year for permits. It was about the same as 2017, down a little bit 2019. In 2021, you already see a big movement in terms of new permits coming online. This is good news. Now, again, a lot of this has to do with that confluence of events. The weak market driven by tax changes, higher interest rates, turning into this incredibly tight market driven by low interest rates and tight inventories. Is it a bubble? Not even close. The mortgage markets are incredibly clean. The share of mortgage origination over 720 never been higher. Mortgage payments as a percent of disposable personal income. This is still a cheap housing market, believe it or not. The big issue in housing is going to be in a few years if inflation creeps in and inflation really starts to push interest rates up. That's the only major risk for housing. The fundamentals are great. For at least the next couple of years, housing is going to be great. As for apartments itself, you keep hearing all this craziness about 40 million people being evicted, yet really only 1.5%, 2% of renters aren't paying now from last year. No, there is no eviction for 30 to 40 million people looming. This is just another element of miserabilism. And if you look at the Medford area, despite all the nonsense you've seen over the last year, it's still incredibly tight apartment market, 2.5% vacancy rate. You need apartments here, you need single families here, build it. And with that in mind, it's worth discussing that state just south of you, California, which again has no housing, is not building any housing. They haven't been doing it forever. And people in California continue to move out of the state because of the lack of housing. And where are they moving? Well, Arizona, Oregon, and Idaho, folks. And remember, this is not a bad thing. Labor shortages are the word of the day. And the more folks move up in the Oregon region, move here into Medford, move into that new housing stock, the more sustainable growth can be in this particular region. Welcome it, embrace it, be part of it, because it is the key to long-run health in this particular region. Last but not least, I'll just finish up with commercial real estate. Yes, it was an interesting year. Office is getting hammered. Industrial has proven its worth. Big net absorption at the end of last year. Amazon can't buy enough warehouses to get stuff out there. No major problems. Sales volumes are picking up. It's getting easier to get commercial real estate loans. The real issue is office markets, and you can see the hit to office market. What is this all about? Well, you know, we hear about this long-run behavior, new normals, but there is no new normal here. What you're really talking about, of course, in the office space is the fact that offices are starting to recognize people can work from home. You know, and that was always the case. We just never put systems in place over the last year we were forced to. And now, yes, you're starting to realize that maybe we can let our people work from home more often. Now, e-commerce, same sort of thing. A lot of people buying stuff online. What this means, of course, is industrial is doing great, but we have to start talking about retail. We have to start talking about office space. Now, office space isn't dead, nor is everybody going to work from home. Indeed, take a look on the right-hand side. This is an important survey to show you. This was a survey done near the end of last year. They asked 15,000 people, how many days per week do you want to work from home? And 25% said 5 days per week. I don't mind working from home. Now, mind you, this was maybe late summer or early fall last year. I'd like to see how many of these people actually still feel this way after being stuck at home for another 6 months. What's interesting is even back then, well over 35% of people said no more than 1 day per week. Most people want to go to the office. But on the left-hand side, you can see a survey, office using jobs. For the most part, prior to the pandemic, about 10% of days were worked at home. Post-pandemic, we expect about 30%. Now, what this means is there's going to be less square feet per employee. Office doesn't go away, but you're going to have a smaller office for the same number of workers. Now, how does that impact labor markets? Well, interestingly enough, it's actually going to intensify the demand for being downtown. Businesses like to be downtown. Why? Liquid labor markets. You're close to your vendors. You're close to your clients. There's panache. It's just easy. Why don't you work downtown? It's expensive. high cost for office space, high commute costs, so on and so forth. Now, if you use less office space per person, that means more businesses can go downtown. If you have people working from home 1 or 2 days a week, that means less commuting costs. Again, more businesses want to be downtown. So interestingly enough, there's going to be more people living in the burbs and more people working in downtown. And that means, yet again, from a Medford conversation, it's more important than ever to think about how do we invest in our downtown to make that the job center of the future economy. More important than ever to think about downtowns, think about job zones, and how to support and create those things. And as for retail, we have vastly too much retail in the United States and Canada and Australia. We need to start rezoning this. Again, not the destination stuff, right? Not the tourism stuff, but the suburban stuff. People are buying stuff online. It's time to think about what to do with this. It's a land use conversation. My personal favorite fix, let's rezone all retail space across the West Coast to mixed use retail, residential. Fixes 2 birds with 1 stone. So wrapping it all up so we can do a few Q's and A's. As noted, it's tragic. And again, our hearts have to go out to the millions of families across the world that have lost loved ones. Obviously, there's a lot of places still suffering from this problem, particularly like India. However, as bad as it's been, economic standpoint, the V was the only logical outcome. And again, that's exactly what had happened. Now, parts of the economy are still in extreme distress, but we have a lot of growth, a lot of potential growth, and it's going to provide quick relief over the course of the next few months. And let's be clear. I know this sounds weird, but we got lucky. You say, how can you call COVID lucky? Look, when you think about the fact that the Spanish flu killed 50 to 75 billion people, 50 to 75 million people worldwide, and you consider the population back then, about 100 years ago, you realize that the Spanish flu was 100 times more deadly than COVID-19. Let me say it one more time. 100 times more deadly. Please, please, next time, let's have systems in place to deal with this. Let's not make the incredibly stupid mistakes we did this time because it could have been a lot worse. Baseline forecast, well, I need to update this. We actually did have a 6.5% Q1, 11% Q2, strong growth at the end of the year. Unemployment nationally be well below 5% by the end of the year. Yes, global tourism is going to lag. Exports are going to lag because the rest of the world is behind us, but nevertheless, we're going to be ahead of the game by the end of this year, and 2022 and 2023 are going to be absolutely on fire. There are wild cards. In the very short run, perhaps a new variant of the virus could break out that is truly resistant to the vaccine. In the medium term, a new financial bubble, a little bit more long term, interest rates rising, public debt explosions, a problem with inflation. There are issues out there, many of which stem from the excessive degree of monetary and fiscal policy intervention we did right now. And remember that excessive degree of fiscal and monetary policy intervention was driven by the miserabilism, this unbelievable situation by which we have to just take the most hyperbolic, ridiculous predictions, turn it into reality, and have bad policy following it. We saw that prior to the pandemic. We saw it on fire in the pandemic, even to the point where in this crazy political environment, somehow or other, wearing a mask became conflated with culture wars. And of course, there is no tomorrow. There is no yesterday. There's no sense of history. There's no sense of legacy. Nobody's talking about the fact that we're leaving our children and grandchildren, probably by the time we fix this, get done with this thing, close to $10 trillion in new debt for something that didn't necessitate it. People are not going to look kindly upon our generation, and candidly, they shouldn't. So with that in mind, I should also point out one more thing. Obviously, I'm giving this talk right now, and it will be the last talk for this guy as the head of the chamber, the non-miserabilist, the man who's kept his feet on the ground and has guided the chamber for many years, kept things real in the region, and I, like the rest of you, will miss him. However, I should also say, Eli, welcome on board, and I look forward to working with you in many years to come as you continue to drive this incredible economy here in Southern Oregon and Medford. And with that, whew, I'm done.
Thank you, Dr. Thornburg, for your knowledge and
pleasure.
insights. And we celebrate Mr. Brad Hicks as well, 30 years of service, and he's going out with a bang. And I know he's been a long serving friend of yours as well in the chamber world. So it's going to be very, very much missed around here, especially with the chamber forums. Lots of good information. I'm thrilled to hear all your optimism. I think I speak for everybody that we all want, and we're all ready.
I'm gonna take a little umbrage with that. It's not optimism. This is a realistic assessment of what's going on. It just looks optimistic relative to the crap you're reading in the papers on a day-to-day basis, right?
Yep.
And that's really unfortunate. It's really unfortunate that we have this disconnect between economic realities and political conversations, policy conversations.
Yep. No, absolutely. And it's reassuring to see all your positive data for sure. Let's go ahead and open it up to questions and answers. I know we got a few here. If you haven't yet, to our viewers, go ahead and input your questions under the Q&A feature and get those submitted, and we'll go through them. So first one up, Dr. Thornburg, you said we're entering the roaring 20s. You expounded on some of the winners and losers. What specific industries do you see thriving within the next 5 years?
Well, right off the bat, I see an enormous bounce back in the travel and tourism sector. People are eager to get out, and you're going to see that sector just going from famine to feast like nobody's business. Beyond that, I mean, it's going to be what I would call kind of the standard. You know, healthcare is going to be a big driver of growth into the future. Manufacturing is important, particularly here in Southern California and Southern Oregon. But remember, it's less of a jobs conversation and more what I would call a local supply chain conversation, because again, productivity enhancements are really important in manufacturing, which is good given the labor shortages that we're dealing with locally and really across the West Coast at this particular time. So, you know, it really is, logistics is going to continue to be a big driver of things. We know that's another growth sector, as the case may be. So, you know, it's what I would call it's those kind of standards that were in place. But again, over the next couple of years, I'm particularly looking for a big bounce back in those tourism sectors that have been hit so hard.
That's great. Great news to hear for Travel Medford.
Yeah.
Another question we have
already doing pretty well, again, because you have access to that drive-in tourism. Now, you know, the key to this is to think about what's happened over the last year and ask yourself, how do we maintain this momentum? You know, we had a great opportunity here. People got up here. They've discovered the magic of this particular region. How do we keep it up? How do we keep our name in front of people's faces? Now more than ever, you know, you want them to do this, to come here.
Yep. Absolutely. Another online question. Dr. Thornburg and I were actually touching base on this before the call, hoping it wouldn't come up, but of course it's a pertinent issue, especially this time of year.
Yeah.
Question is, how do you see the fires affecting migration to Southern Oregon, both long-term and short-term?
Yeah, I mean, look, the answer is not really, right? I mean, forest fires, again, are natural disasters of a sort, right? And natural disasters have severe short-run economic consequences, but very limited long-run ones. People make a decision where they're going to move, where you're going to retire, where do you want to raise your family. You're not thinking about those type of situations. You're talking about housing, you're talking about education, you're talking about quality of life. So it shouldn't make that big of a difference. But with that in mind, what I would say, it also becomes incredibly important for local land use authorities to work hard to, if you will, minimize the potential impact of fires on your community. And that means at some level, yeah, having a conversation about sprawl, particularly sprawl that puts you right into the path of those wildfires when you're building up in the hills. I know people don't want to be bothered with that kind of stuff, but you know, let's take a fire a couple of years ago up in Santa Rosa. You know, they built 4,000 homes in an area that had over the last 100 years, 3 massive forest fires ripped through there. And gee, the last forest fire burned down 3,000 homes in there. And you say, well, why would you build there? You got to have a common sense approach to land use that reduces the risk of these fires becoming a human tragedy. That's what you have to do.
Yeah. Well said. Touch on a little, and you touched on it briefly in your presentation, how at the same time can we be at the tail end of a recession and pandemic, yet have record housing and record stock market prices?
Well, again, it's not that kind of recession, right? You think about, we had very little income hit, despite those giant labor market numbers. And on top of that, you had the federal government and the Federal Reserve lobbing massive amounts of cash, just massive amounts of cash into the economy. And that's, again, exactly how financial markets start to take off. Now, I will say this. It is different than last time around because the housing market's taking off, but it's completely sustainable. There is no bubble in housing. It could turn into one. We'll see. But at this point in time, I got no concerns whatsoever that the gains you're seeing in housing are not sustainable. They're absolutely sustainable. Prices aren't going down anytime in the near future. It's just the nature, again, of the excessive degree of policy reaction. It was going to be a good year for housing anyway, to be honest with you. But now, because of this, it's even crazier. And again, those tight inventories, the panic people are going into, it creates this feedback effect. And yeah, it's hot, 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 hot. So, yeah.
Good. All right, next online question. Aside from the obvious, any thoughts about how we are going to, or our kids are going to pay for this government spending at every level?
Yeah, higher taxes. And it's as simple as that. I mean, you cannot continue to run a government on fumes. At some point in time, you got to pay the piper. It's a big problem. Now, you know, at some level, you know, it's not as big of an issue as you think, in as much as, for the most part, Americans hold the debt that the U.S. government is issuing, right? And so when the government gets around to having to, shall we, pay off this debt, at some level what they're doing is taking taxes from some people and giving that money to other people within the economy. So it becomes a big transfer. But remember, we're borrowing the money, giving it to ourselves, and then we're going to retire. And our kids are going to have to pay these higher taxes. And the question all your kids are going to have is, hey, when are you going to die so I can get all your assets? You know, and you know, that's not how you want the world to work, right?
Yeah.
It's really poor planning. And of course, the other part of it is this. Remember, it isn't just Americans buying this debt, and it's the rest of the world. We're running the biggest trade deficit ever, which when you look at it on the other side, that also means the most amount of foreign borrowing ever. And that foreign borrowing is going to be paid back without, shall we say, a transfer to the next generation.
All right. Next question, Dr. Thornburg. I know that you yourself have visited Medford in the Rogue Valley a number of times, and as a professional forecaster, would love to hear your predictions about our overall economic growth in our region in the years to come.
Yeah, well, listen, let's look across the West Coast, okay, and think about what's happening out here. Phenomenal demand to be here. We know that. Why not? It's one of the most beautiful places on the planet. The climate's fantastic. And then you think up and down the coast and you ask yourself, well, San Diego's out of reach. Los Angeles is out of reach. The Central Coast is out of reach. Bay Area is out of reach. Oh, by the way, Seattle's out of reach. Portland and Vancouver are getting out of reach and are a little crazy. And so what do you got left? And the answer is the kind of Northern California, Southern Oregon part of the coast. So you are what I would call one of the last vestiges of the old West Coast, one that is more industrial based, more commodity based. But that's not going to last. Again, it's really, from my perspective, I look at this region and I call it one of the most, one of the biggest secrets on the West Coast. Right? Now, it's not going to be a secret for long. People are retired. They want to find a place to go. And what do they want? They want great amenities. They want a beautiful place. They want housing that's affordable. They want a good airport to be by. That's Medford, people.
Yep.
So trends in the region can and should be really good. The question for the region is, do you want this? Are you ready for it? Are you going to invest in it? Or are you going to fight against it? Fighting against this kind of stuff, which is really what a lot of California has done over the last 25 years, leads you to the kind of crazy problems that California has. The region has to embrace growth and work with it. And that's I mean, and you know, again, there's a middle ground there. I'm not saying let the developers do whatever they want, but at the same time, you can't let the NIMBY shut everything down. You have to have conversation You have to have cooperation. You have to have mutual understanding for the various forces to come up with a plan for the entire community. And these conversations, like many conversations in the United States, have become excessively hostile, with too many people running around drawing lines in the sand, screaming, no, never, no how. And that's not how you run an economy. And, you know, Eli, you're going to have your hands cut out for you for the next couple of years, because a chamber has to be the center of that conversation. The chamber is where these conversations between residents, business, and governments need to take place, so you can find the common ground to put into place the growth plans necessary. And, you know, I wish you luck.
I appreciate it, Dr. Thornburg, and we'll wrap it up with that last question. And I agree, and we're having a lot of those conversations already. And to answer somebody's brief question on there is, you know, what's the plan moving forward? And a lot of that is going to be dictated by the board of directors and how we unfold and paint the picture that's going to be the future. And we as staff are thrilled. We celebrate Brad's 30 years of service, and you, Dr. Thornburg, for being here. We thank you again for your insights and taking the time.
I am here. I am actually.
You're literally here. Yeah, he's literally on the road.
When I get done with this, I'm going to go
himself.
enjoy this wonderful weather.
You go ahead and jump in. It's nice
place.
and cold this time of year. So
yeah,
with that, thank you, Dr. Thornburg, again. We'll go ahead and turn it over to Jason Foster for some closing remarks.
Thank you, Eli. I appreciate it. And thank you again, Dr. Thornburg, for being here with us today. The future of our economy is a topic that, you know, it's on everybody's mind. We appreciate you taking some time to participate in today's program. And with that, I'd like to also thank all of our forum sponsors. We appreciate you. This event is not possible without you. So thank you. And thank you to all of our viewers for attending. With the state beginning to open up, we are hopeful that we'll be meeting in person again. And for the forum and for other chamber events here towards the end of the year. And thank you for everyone for your gracious support of the chamber and our programs. And we look forward to finishing out this virtual season strong and having all of you join us again in person when we're able to do so. We'll see you guys here next month, Monday, June 14th, for Jackson County sponsored program. Thank you. Have a great day.